Once again, for those joining us, my name is Kaylor Sweeney, and I'm the Common Ground Initiative Program Manager for the Hallenstein Center for Presidential Studies. For those that were able to attend, I hope you enjoyed the reception and had some great discussions on today's topic. You'll have the opportunity to carry on those discussions over dessert following the keynote. I want to note that we'll be using question cards for today's Q&A, so please be sure to get one of those from our staff. They'll be going through in rounds, and hold those up so they can easily collect them. As many of you know, a key component of the Hallenstein Center programming is the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. Every year, a cohort of student leaders join us for a unique leadership development experience. At each event, we invite one of the fellow candidates to present a leadership minute, a brief reflection on their personal leadership journey. It is my privilege to introduce to you CLA fellow candidate Jessie Webb to share her leadership minute and introduce our moderator for the evening. Jessie Webb is a current senior studying elementary education with an emphasis in English. She is currently engaging in her field placement as a student teacher this academic year in a 5th grade classroom at Alpine Elementary. She is an ambitious individual who is looking forward to engaging in graduate school, but will first be enjoying a gap year while experiencing her first year as a teacher. Her future studies will include programs on teaching and curriculum, with a focus on social justice and equity, potentially through a historical lens. As a current TRIO member and first-generation college student, Jessie takes great pride in her ability to be resilient. After having 2 children while still in school, she finds it extremely important to be a strong role model for her children and to help advocate for those who need it. When Jessie is on campus, she is always looking for opportunities to engage in research on matters surrounding equity in our educational system. Besides her school engagements, Jessie is also a volunteer coach for I-9's 5th grade basketball program and her daughter's t-ball team. Family is something that inspires her to be her best self, and she hopes to help inspire others one day as well. Please join me in welcoming Jessie.
First off, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Jessie Webb, and I am a Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy candidate. I want to say that this is my first year in the CLA program, and I'm soon to be alumni in just a week as I approach my graduation date. Yes, excitement. Throughout my experience in college, I have undergone many changes in my life. I have become a mother to 2 beautiful children who are actually in the back right now. I have a 5-year-old daughter and then a son who is 1 year old now. For those of you who have children, you may be able to relate to the 1 a.m. feedings, maybe a 3 a.m. wake up from a nightmare. And I can say that nevertheless, I have loved every day of being a mother. But being a mother and a wife and student, all while working, presented many challenges. I found many ways to persevere through the tireless nights. And one may ask, why keep going? Well, as a first-generation college student, one may perceive that the pressures from family would keep me persevering through. I knew, though, that was not the thing for me. It was, for me, having to do with achieving the ultimate dream. The dream of one day having my own classroom where I can foster the creativity, excitement, and the passion for learning. A classroom where every child feels seen. A classroom where each child is celebrated for their individuality, for their tenacity. I knew from a young age that education was for me. Although there'd be many challenges I would face throughout my educational journey, I am thankful to be standing here before you today. I am more knowledgeable and understanding than I have ever been before. I was once a girl with limited understanding of what leadership looks like. I thought leaders were only the ones in the history books, as maybe many of you thought. Now I understand that not only am I a leader, but those in this room today are also leaders. I know that leadership is not a one-size-fits-all, because great leaders show up and they show out in all areas of life. Leaders are the ones that are persevering each and every day, just as I have persevered and overcome many tribulations. I know many in the room today have as well. I am grateful to have had the opportunity to learn more about my own leadership and how I can continue to make a difference in others' lives, especially in the lives of my future students and for my own children. With that said, I would like to give each of you a call to action today. We are about to embark on a learning opportunity together. And as an educator, I do believe that learning is never done. Education is beyond the K through 12 years. because every day we have plentiful opportunities to learn from those around us. You may look around, maybe just for a second, and acknowledge that those in this room have a lot of knowledge to share. Something that I find extremely important as an educator and as a leader is better understanding of others' perspectives. My own fifth graders in my current placement, they have been learning the value of hearing others' opinions and their thoughts and how best to actively listen and not only take in those important conversations, but then to be able to converse their differences. I want you to be able to take today and consider others' opinions in the room and know that we're going to have very different opinions. This world is very large with many others who may not think like you. I encourage you today and every day to listen, to understand, to be open-minded, and to always be willing to actively listen to connect better with those around you. And as an educator and as a leader, I know that the best leader possesses such skills. So today, I encourage all of you to practice these skills and to continue our growth as citizens and leaders today. My name is Jessie Webb, and I am a leader. Now, as I introduce our moderator for this evening, I want to welcome our panelists to the stage. You can make your way up here now. Megan Rydecki joined the Heinstein Center as the director in January 2023. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in the International Relations of Masters in Public Administration, both from Grand Valley State University. Prior to joining the Heinstein Center, Megan spent time in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, serving at the City of Wyoming, International City and County Management Association, The Right Place, CQL, and most recently, Consumers Energy. Her community involvement is extensive, highlighted by service to Grand Rapids, Whitewater, and Grand Rapids Public Museum, and the Board of Trustees at Grand Valley State University. These experiences have allowed Megan to recognize the leadership potential in everyone, and she is dedicated to empowering the generation of leaders for the world to come.
Well, everyone, good evening, and I'd like to reiterate my thanks for you all being here and joining us for our Progressive Conservative Summit. So, former Congressman Peter Meijer is a fourth-generation West Michigander. Peter served in the Army Reserves and deployed to Iraq in 2010 to conduct intelligence operations. Later, he led disaster response efforts in South Sudan and the Philippines before working with an international NGO in Afghanistan, managing a large team to provide conflict analysis to humanitarian groups and deliver emergency assistance after kidnappings and targeted killings. In Congress, Peter served on the Homeland Security, Foreign Affairs, and Science, Space, and Technology committees and was a member of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus. He holds a BA from Columbia University and an MBA from New York University. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Dr. Adam London is the Administrative Health Officer for Kent County and Director of the Kent County Health Department, a role he has held since 2013. He's earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Industrial and Environmental Health Management from Ferris State University and a Master of Public Administration degree from Grand Valley State University, go Lakers, and a PhD in Public Health from Walden University. Prior to his role with Kent County, Dr. London was working with local public health departments here in Michigan since 1998. While addressing a multitude of public health challenges over the past 25 years, he's most well known for being the incident commander of Kent County's COVID-19 pandemic response. He is co-founder of the Kent County Population Health Consortium, chair of the Kent County Family and Children Coordinating Council, and a past president of the National Environmental Health Association. Dr. London also teaches courses in public health and administration as an adjunct at GVSU, the University of Michigan, Michigan State University, Western Michigan University, and Ferris State. Welcome, Adam. So, Peter and Adam, thank you again for being here. We know that both of you have had personal experience with political violence and or threats of violence, and we're really, just fortunate to have you here to share some of your experience today. With that, let's jump right in. So to start off, how has polarization more generally and political violence specifically impacted you, the people you've worked with, and those who served in your roles?
Yeah, so thank you, Megan, and thanks everyone for being here this evening. It's a great conversation, and I think that, we've all been affected by political violence and how it's shaped our world and reshaped our world as a result of the pandemic. When I think about my team and the people that I work with, I have 250 positions at the Kent County Health Department, and about 100 of those have turned over during the course of the past 3 years, which is really extraordinary turnover for us. Now, when I would meet with the employees before the pandemic and ask many of those that had been there for a long time, why are you still here? Why haven't you retired? They would often say, I'm here because it brings me joy. I'm here because it makes a difference, and that's really what it's all about for so many who work in public service. Now, I've seen and heard from staff over the course of the past 3 years that some of the joy has come out of the work. And that is one of the factors that's led to that turnover. So that's kind of the bad news. The good news is, in fact, I just met with our new staff last week, and there's about 100 of them that are new. And I say, are you guys nuts? Have you been watching? Do you know what kind of polarization is out there? And they say, no, that's why we're here. We're here because it matters to us. It's meaningful, purposeful work. It's a little bit, I think, like public service is a little bit like the ministry or the military, where it's a calling. People are drawn to it because it matters. And I think that's inspiring for me and so many others that see that the people who are joining now are doing so with eyes wide open and are doing so because they want to serve and make our communities better, despite the aggression and some of the toxic stuff that's happened over the past several years.
Sure.
That was a much more hopeful opening than I was going to give.
Here we go.
I'm very grateful for everyone here today. Megan, thank you for inviting us. I guess to put it in very concise ways, I've seen people change their mind on things knowing the pressure or blowback they might get. I've seen, I've known folks who were planning on running for office and then looked at sort of the environment they might be stepping into and made a calculation after talking with their family that even if they themselves are willing to do it, and then this is I guess political violence on sort of one end, but just sort of the tension and everything that's kind of to the left of it on the spectrum of intensity, they changed their minds on whether or not to pursue. And I'm so deeply grateful for those who do choose to step forward, but especially in an environment where that service, depending on someone's background and qualifications, they may make more in the private sector than the public sector. You hope that drive and passion for service can overcome, the financial hit, or opportunity cost. But then when you layer on and stack on top of that deficit additional chances of having your people show up at your house or your kids getting ridiculed or harassed at school by classmates. I've known colleagues who pulled their kids out of school after a vote, or had to, in some cases have them live with family members. And, on the one hand, the materialized violence is relatively rare. The threats can be very constant. I thought I'd only gotten a couple of death threats, and relative, because I have some female colleagues, by the way, and female politicians get easily 10x or 50x the type of harassment and vitriol that male politicians get, and that is not a partisan component, it's pretty evenly distributed. But I was talking with a female colleague, and she said, it was just like, oh yeah, no, we got 200 this week. And I was like, oh man, we've gotten 5. And I checked with my staff, and they were like, oh wait, you're not being CC'd on those reports to Capitol Police? I was like, okay guys, you got to keep me in the loop here. And then I went back, and it was a little bit more even. But I think we should be doing everything we can to try to tilt that playing field back towards having a public service that is not viewed as yet another realm in which to fight. The election, the dialogue, that debate, if you're not engaged in the art of persuasion, but you feel that that is ineffective and you shift to intimidation, you wind up in a circumstance where, in the best case scenario, some folks self-select and say it's bad and I feel like I should step forward and I want to be kind of leading that charge. In the worst case scenario, and this is much more on the political side, people say, oh, that looks like fun. I want to go do that. And it becomes a more baser, superficial impulse. It's somebody who doesn't run towards the fire because they want to put it out, but they run towards it because they like the flames. And I think that is probably not a great long-term strategy for a free country.
Yeah, I think we've all probably had the conversation looking at candidates, and we've been fortunate to have really great representatives come out of the West Michigan area, but people who have the conversation and say, well, who am I going to pick, the lesser of two evils, or who would be crazy enough to run right now? There's a lot of smart people out there who may not. How do we change that? How do we change that tide so that the good, smart, honest, best people do want to pursue these kind of roles and these kind of offices?
A lot of it has to do with what forum someone's engaging in, right? It is so sad how disproportionately heard the loudest, angriest voices are when they're oftentimes in no way, shape, or form reflective of the body politic. But if that's all you're seeing on social media, if that's all you're hearing about when you go to a town hall, because usually it's not people who feel ambivalent who take the time out of their day to show up. It's ideally people who are incredibly passionate and supportive. More realistically, it's kind of the political conversation equivalent of graffiti. Like it's going to tend towards extremes. Nobody spray paints, this wall is okay. It's either passionate support or passionate opposition. And so, being counterweighting a little bit of that with making sure you're engaging with your elected officials, and not just I love this or I hate that. But at the same time, also not trying to give power to those loudest voices by immediately paying the most attention to folks who objectively don't have a lot of influence or don't have a lot of power, but by the fact that they're willing to say things that are controversial, even if it's somebody you despise, that act of feeling in your heart a sense of hatred is giving them power. It's giving them agency. It's elevating them to a position they don't deserve to be in ways that become self-fulfilling.
Yeah, and I think we really need to start with inviting people to the conversation and encouraging participation. And I think we learned that during the pandemic is that people who are isolated, they're excluded, they're disenfranchised. In many cases, they're receiving information that it's not complete. They tend to manifest behaviors that are disordered, and we see that on both sides. This is not exclusive to one side or the other. This is human behavior, and it's very much like how we look at other complicated, wicked problems like mental illness and so many of the other challenging issues we're faced with. Is how do we really get to core root causes and unpack these things in a way that's productive to get people to be involved in the process early on and to become educated and to be part of the conversation, have a role in the participation of decision-making early on.
Well, in that sense of somebody feeling like they have a role, feeling like they have a voice, you can feel that way on the internet when somebody's responding back to you. And if you see decisions being made in your political environment that you don't agree with, and that you feel, even when you were saying you're disagreeing, you're shouting into a vacuum, right? If you feel like the institutions that we have are unable to peaceably resolve conflicts or unable to appropriately reflect somebody's belief, and especially when you're talking in maybe an echo chamber, on an online space, or you're consuming media content that is just kind of driving you to look at the world, not for how you're seeing it when you're out and about, not necessarily for what you see in your community, but to believe that there's some, evil entity out there doing something horrific. And whether that's, a liberal thinking that Texas, is post-apocalyptic conservative wasteland, or a Republican thinking that about California, you begin to inherently devalue the institutions that we have. And to me, and by the way, I'm not trying to draw moral equivalencies or relative equivalencies. And one of the things that I think is so bad is we spend a lot of time arguing about what's worse rather than saying, no, that was bad, right? But the through line between, I think, the violence we saw over the summer of 2020 and the violence at the Capitol on January 6th was folks believing that they could not address their frustrations through the institutions, that the institutions that we have as sort of our common arbiter were irreparably corrupt or irreparably delegitimate. And so the only thing left then, the logical conclusion, is to work outside of those institutions. And if we don't try to restrain those impulses and channel things back within our institutions and make sure that our institutions work well, make sure that we can trust the people within them, to make sure that with the heightened transparency we have, maybe 100 years ago you could have gotten away with a lot more if you were just an absolute idiot in a bureaucratic position. Now that all of the stupid things you've done and said are going to get FOIA'd out the wazoo and pasted, on a partisan website. If we don't do a better job of making our institutions ones that we can trust, then also trusting our institutions, right? It's a two-way street. Then those mechanisms get devalued, and then we lose something really, really important. We lose a sense of that there are things that can be neutral, and if you lose that neutrality, then every ethic is a situational ethic. Everything just becomes broken.
Yeah.
And I swear I'm going to be more optimistic later, but we're like, we need to kind of dive down and then pull on
okay.
it's like a J curve.
That's okay. We'll pull you out. That's fine. Adam, you touched on COVID-19 for a minute. The pandemic and the subsequent governmental responses proved to be more fuel for the fire for political polarization. Specifically, health officials at all levels across the United States experienced harassment. Can you speak to the impact this has had on health outcomes and the public health profession, either nationally or here in West Michigan?
Yeah, so it's been a challenge, right? We've seen about a quarter of people in my position leave in the past few years. I talked a little bit about the turnover. Recruitment has been a challenge. While those who are coming to us are fantastic and they're energized, we still have a challenge with getting enough of them. So that's a problem. And then we look at outcomes. And by the way, that's not exclusive to public health. My friends and colleagues at the hospitals downtown would say the same thing, that they have a massive talent problem right now, getting enough great people to come into their organization. They've lost a lot. So this is really the public and medical health system overall that is challenged right now. When we look at outcomes, vaccines come to mind right away. We're seeing waning vaccine coverage rates for measles, mumps, pertussis, rubella, diphtheria, influenza, chickenpox, the whole gamut. We're seeing all of them wane, not just COVID hesitancy and opposition. So that's concerning, especially as some of the more contagious of them, like measles, are hovering near or below what we generally consider herd immunity levels. Then we see things like the challenge we have with mental illness, which was a crisis before the pandemic, which has been exacerbated. We don't have enough psychiatric care beds in those in that profession either. And we have the opioid and substance use pandemics, which were a crisis before COVID. Unfortunately, because we've been so trapped and strapped to COVID for the past several years, we haven't, in public health and medicine or other places, been able to give that pandemic the attention that it really deserves. And when I talk to professionals at the hospitals or at some of the psychiatric care centers, they talk about some of the new and emerging issues, like cannabis-induced psychosis with our young people. That's an upcoming issue, and we're certainly not prepared for that. So all of these challenges have been exacerbated and are getting worse. And we look at life expectancy in the US, for the first time in a long time, we've had 2 consecutive years where our life expectancy has decreased. And that's not just a COVID thing, because it's not happening to the same level in other parts of the world. And when we look within that decrease, we see a greater problem, which is the disparity of the effect. with white Americans seeing about a 2.4-year reduction in life expectancy, and Hispanic and Black Americans seeing life expectancy decreases of over 4 years. So that's a problem that we've seen exacerbated. And then we have this general distrust of people like myself and the healthcare profession. And I think people like me in public service at a government level are pretty easy to demagogue, right? We work for government. And so it's pretty easy when things are polarized to say, well, that's the government guy talking. I get that. That's part of the challenge we've always been faced with. But every poll that's ever been taken about your doctor, your physician, has always said that we as a society hold them in high regard. Now we're seeing that start to come back and that start to decline, or people don't trust their doctor anymore. So the political conflict and these issues are starting to affect how people trust their physician and their nurse. And that's a challenge as well. So all of this puts us in a very vulnerable spot going forward to make sure that we have the preventative health care, the health care for the needs that we have right now, and the health care in place for the new and emerging things, which are going to be a challenge for us in the coming years.
Your point about life expectancy and whatnot, many of us probably heard some recent studies about maternal health care and maternal mortality, and it's mortality rates are increasing in the United States, and I was flabbergasted to hear that. And it's just, your rationale right now makes perfect sense leading into that, but it's really sort of alarming, some of these trends and where we're headed for some of that. So somewhat tied to that, and Peter, you just touched on this a little bit, but talking about how political violence is a last resort, and how do we ensure that people have peaceful methods and nonviolent methods for working out their frustrations, bringing their concerns, and that sort of thing. Adam, certainly you sat through some really long county commission meetings during COVID, and a lot of people who came out to give commentary who probably never had been to a meeting before. And so, as we think about how do we create these safe spaces, as challenging as that was there any silver lining to say, hey, look, this many people are actually engaging in government because they want to have a voice about this particular thing?
Yeah, so certainly we do want the population engaged. It's unfortunate that, we went into a pandemic really not prepared with that level of awareness about what the plans are going into it. And I hope that's something we learn in this moment is how do we take all those lessons learned, dissect them, and clearly have a plan in place for heaven for the next time that happens, long after I've retired. Because, I think about things like the Public Health Code, which was put in place by the people of Michigan through the legislative process and signed by a governor in 1978, that gives people like me the power and the duty to identify public health hazards and react in a particular way. And so when the unfortunate circumstance of a pandemic arrives, people like me had to make tough decisions. And we had, as officers of the law, a duty, spelled out the law to carry out certain actions. And so, not surprisingly, many people were shocked by that. And it doesn't appeal to the democratic principles that we all have, because it seems like it's giving one bureaucrat an awful lot of power, and that's not right. And maybe it's not right. But that's the kind of thing we need to think about now, is how do we, if we don't like that law, how do we change that law or improve upon it and have a system in place that we can agree to as a society, so that the next time we're not surprised that a certain office has particular powers and duties.
Are you suggesting our legislative branch is not functioning as well as it maybe should? No. Well, and like my answer to that takes a little bit of a roundabout path, but it definitely, I think part of the reason why it was such kind of a rude awakening for folks who didn't feel like who hadn't really been politically involved, didn't really feel like they needed to be until there were decisions being made that maybe they felt weren't reflective of what they had wanted. And then the only kind of option is not is not the engagement ahead of time to say, in the event of a pandemic, we should probably, brush up on the laws that we have, make sure they're still relevant to today. The amount of times I've looked at an issue at the federal level, and ideally, it was a law that really hadn't been changed since the 1960s or early 1970s. In some cases, laws that hadn't been changed since World War I era, right? But we just kind of have that legislative inertia where it's a lot easier to pass a new law than to repeal an old one, which I can vouch as somebody who's been trying to, an authorization for use of military force from the Eisenhower era that's still living out there, that not a single person has told me has any reason to be kept on the books, passed with unanimous consent in the House. The Senate's like, oh, we love this thing, never end up taking it up. Anyways, I digress. Like, it is so much easier to pass a new law than to repeal an old one. But the two trends over the past several decades that I think have been so deeply problematic for the way our government functions has been, on the one hand, power always going up. Federal government taking power away from the states, state governments taking power away from municipalities, many times because those municipalities had failed in part of their responsibility. But instead of having the voters of that constituency holding their elected officials responsible, the lesson learned was that level of government can't be trusted, so we're going to elevate it up. You do that long enough, and all of a sudden, most of our engagement with the government is at the federal level. It's at the highest level. It's at the least responsive entity because of how far you have to go to get something done, and one that is really not well suited to address most of the challenges in most of the ways in which we interact with government. So that on the one hand, but then within each of those levels, as that power is going up, it flows from less democratic bodies, from less accountable bodies, from more accountable bodies to less accountable bodies, from our legislative branches to our executive branches. So not only, are we thinking not, what is my city council going to do? What is my state legislature, or my county commission going to do? What's my state legislature going to do before we think of what Congress is going to do? But we say, well, what's my mayor going to do? What's my governor going to do? And that leads us to a place where those elected officials continuously overpromise. They say things that they literally cannot do, and then when they try to do something, it's thrown out, and then they blame the judicial branch, or they blame the process or something else, right? So there's this overpromising that inherently leads to the inevitable under-delivering, and then people grow disillusioned and disenfranchised, dissatisfied with that feeling that this person told me they're going to do something, they can't do it, they're all liars, so let's throw these liars out and bring in the other guys who are over-promising, who are just going to do the exact same thing. Right? And then the polarization, not just polarization, but the kind of ping-ponging polarization that brings in. And very actually hard from both a political standpoint and from a legislative standpoint. But the solution to that is reinvigorating local governance, right? Having a sense that, I can actually see the fruits of my investment in politics when I'm engaged at the municipal level, when I'm engaged at the county level, far more than if I'm always relying on the state or the federal government to do that. And not taking all of these little shortcuts that were taken because they're easy, but saying we need to trust a process. It is the most dissatisfying thing to hear an elected official say, well, the process means that we need to wait, we need to take a pause, we need to do this. That is so incredibly infuriating to hear, but it's something that sometimes need to be said. Because you may love that official who is shortcutting the process or circumventing, you may love what they're doing and say, well, maybe it's not ideal, but they're cracking that door open with that exception. And the next person's going to come through and you're probably not going to like them, and they're just going to kick that door wide open, right? So we keep establishing these precedents, maybe that were justified in the moment, but are going to be abused to all get out down the line. And so retaining that sense of discipline, but also just getting engaged at the local level. That is, I think of how many folks on January 6th who ended up getting arrested, who hadn't voted. That's just like, okay, it's the political violence equivalent of like cramming for the exam at the way last minute and not showing up at a single class, right? Like, you're gonna fail that, and it's your your fault that you failed. You put in no preparation, right? You get into that habit of getting engaged and seeing something happening. It's a lot harder to feel like these people that are sitting next to you, that you're having a conversation with, that you're getting to know, even if you disagree with that individual, you can still learn to respect them as a person, but you're never gonna do that with somebody you're engaging with on social media or just seeing on cable news. Or someone whose office represents 1 million or 10 million individuals, and you're not gonna build that relationship the way you can. And so you lose all of those little release valve opportunities to blow off steam that can arise and suspicion in the absence of the personal trust.
So let's put a little spin. I love what you're saying about engaging locally. But Adam, I'm curious to know what you have seen over the past couple of years, this idea of making decisions at a local level, but having people who run for office and truly understand which decisions get made where. How has the national polarization and ideological scene affected local government?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting, right? And I think we've all seen how things have changed. And first of all, I want to say that here in Kent County, our Kent County Board of Commissioners has really been terrific. And I'm not saying it just to give them lip service. Truly, they have been faced with, like commissioners in many places, with extraordinary circumstances and decisions they never envisioned coming before them when they ran for those offices. While there may have been moments and things that I disagreed with, I have never for a moment thought that they weren't there representing the best interest of the community. So I have that to be thankful for here, because I know that hasn't been the case in a lot of other places. And when we look at kind of a platform that people have been running on lately for local offices at county, township, city, village, it's gone from things like the millage, the parkland acquisition, the waste management, the emergency response, the granular things that are so important to life in the community. It's sort of the big social issues of the day, whether they think about the Constitution or for or against abortion or guns or transgender athletes, or all these things that are really, really unlikely to ever cross their desk in a meaningful way at the township or the county. And so that's an opportunity and a need for us as public administrators to work with them to bring them up to speed with what the job entails and the enormity of the issues that are going to come before them as elected officials in those roles. As elected or as professional staff, it's also a challenge to us to adjust to this. So I'll give you a couple quick examples. Prior to the pandemic, when I would go to Lansing or to Washington to talk to our elected officials about an important issue, let's say it was public health emergency preparedness funding, and I wanted to see a bill passed that would increase the amount of funding for public health emergency response. If I was meeting with a progressive, I would talk about how this is an issue of health equity and making sure that all the people in our community have access to the resources and increased resilience so that they can get through a crisis safely. And in my next appointment, I might have a session with a conservative where I'm going to talk about the same exact bill from a perspective of national security and public safety and protecting our way of life and the economy back home. And both of those approaches would have been absolutely truthful. And there was no deception in either approach. I was being absolutely straight on authentic with them, but recognizing that they needed to hear the issue from a certain perspective. And now we're starting to see the same thing at other levels. And so we have to be very careful and intentional about the language we use when bringing forth action requests or things that we want to see moved forward, not because we're being deceptive, but because we have to speak to them where they're at. Another example would be the partnerships that we have, because in public health we have to engage with community organizations and we have to go where the people are at. And that means partnering with organizations on the left and the right, and people that you may agree with and people that you don't. But if the people of Kent County are going to an event and those event organizers want us to be there to give out information or vaccines or lead test or radon test, whatever it might be, we're going to be there, regardless of whether it's the Pride Parade or the Knights of Columbus breakfast. We're going to do our best to be there because we serve the people of Kent County. However, this creates an opportunity for those who view those groups sometimes as the other and see us there present to assume that we somehow are advocating the enormity of the span of things that they believe in. And so that sometimes creates conflict for us when those elected officials or those persons see that we were there, so we must be 100% behind their mission, their agenda, and that we're not somehow representing the entirety of the community. So just be very careful now to really be as transparent as possible. We always do that, and make sure that we're recognizing where people are coming from, because the climate is so highly charged right now.
Yeah. Speaking of that highly charged environment, Peter, a question for you. Do you believe that political parties have a role in preventing and condemning political violence?
It would be wonderful if they did, right? It'd be wonderful if we had parties that said, you know what, we should be measured in how we're approaching something. We should not, let our rhetoric slip into the realm where, we seem to be encouraging or potentially condoning violence. Instead, we have parties who are more than happy to point out, the sliver in the other party's eye, but at the same time not willing to hold their own, co-partisans to that same standard. And again, it just becomes, you have parties not arguing about whether or not something's right or wrong, but just always excusing whatever happens on their side and arguing that what the other side's doing is worse. So they absolutely should. And it's really an amazing dynamic between our parties. Like if either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, got their stuff together, the other would really have to sharpen their pencils very quickly. Instead, we're left in a more demoralizing position where both just, are not performing well, but they can say, well, but the other guys are doing worse, and so we don't have to worry. We're in a two-party system, we will, we'll be the victors by default. And so I'd love to see that, but I think it's also part of a challenge of our primary environment as well. I think of how I'm mentioning some of those trends of kind of political consolidation. At the same time, there used to be such diversity of thought from a stance standpoint within both of our main political parties. And they have become excruciatingly homogeneous over the past 2 decades, as have our voting behaviors. 20 years ago, the correlation between what party somebody voted for at a county level and who they voted for on a statewide ballot, such as Senate or governor, that correlation was 0.55. So it was, if there's a correlation, incredibly loose, essentially non-determinative who you're voting for at a local level versus statewide. And over 2 decades, it went from 0.55 to 0.91, which is almost a perfect correlation. 0.95. So I mean, just massive shifts in how we view the parties and how we view our role within them. And as a result, what's lost in that is that slimming number of persuadable voters that actually decide the outcome. And the other major consequence over the past several decades, with better data analysis at the voter level, we went from, in 2000, of the 435 House seats, 180 of those House seats during the presidential election were within a 10-point band. So whoever won with less than 10 points, 55 to 45 and tighter. Fast forward to 2020, we go from 2022, after the redistricting maps, we went from 180 out of 435 that were viewed as competitive to 60. So that number has gone down by 2/3. So the sad reality is the parties have way less of an incentive to be doing the things that are restraining, that may not scare away moderates, that may be trying to emphasize persuadable voters, the marginal voters going to determine the outcome. They have less of an incentive to do that because of how much more important the partisan dynamics have become, how much devalued the sort of emphasis on independence. You lose the muscles that you used to flex to try to make those persuadable voters persuaded, and then add on all of the intangible benefits where that party doesn't really need to win in order to win that general election, right? They don't necessarily need to gain power within government in order to actually prosper and have the members of that party get really lucrative, brand building and media opportunities. In some cases, losing, whether you're Stacey Abrams or Carrie Lake, losing can still be the fantastic thing that happened for your career. You'll be able to make more money and spend a lot more time on TV than you would if you would have won that election. So again, kind of shame on us, right? That becomes, but that's ways in which the parties end up being very reflective of their constituents as well.
Yeah. Adam, any thoughts you want to add to that?
No, I think that Peter has summed it up pretty well. I do think that the margin of people who don't have a strong opinion on matters seems to be diminishing. But sometimes I think we're just not hearing from them as well. And whether they're not engaged or they're not coming to their township or their county commission meetings and vocalizing their opinions, I don't know. But certainly those on the extremes are very motivated.
Yeah.
Hard to know if that person who's not making their voice heard is staying quiet because they're content, or they feel there's absolutely no point.
Or they're intimidated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into some of our audience questions here. There's a couple here that have to do with trust. We talked about, Peter, you talked quite a bit about how do we trust our institutions. And so a couple of folks want to know, how do you suggest that Americans begin that process of trusting that? And how do we maintain that trust when many feel that entities like the Supreme Court have become so politicized and seem to be working across party lines?
Well, on the pandemic side, I think back to the tabletop exercise they did during the Bush administration on kind of a national pandemic response. And the George Bush administration, or George W. Bush, deserves a lot of credit for some of the public health measures. We just had the 20th anniversary of PEPFAR. I think the estimates are it saved 25 million lives in Africa because of their efforts to tackle AIDS. Yeah. But the conclusion out of this tabletop exercise was that the number one thing the federal government had to ensure they maintained at all times was the confidence and trust of the public. And I think we got into this moment from a very early stage in the current pandemic of people in DC or officials on high thinking that they're talking to people who are dumb. And if you think you're talking to someone who's stupid, then you are trying to anticipate a reaction you expect to be stupid. And then you end up saying something different, right? Or not being truthful, not being honest. The early moment where the kind of infamous quote from the Surgeon General, it was like, don't buy masks, masks don't work, all this. Now, that was intended to try to avoid the shortage of N95 masks we had that were far more needed by public health officials, by doctors, by folks who were getting exposed or in positions where they're far more likely to get exposed to COVID than the average person. But instead of saying, hey, we probably think that this is an effective solution. We've had some studies that point to this. However, your risk relative to that of a doctor or a nurse or somebody else is lower. So we have a shortage. Please, we need to maintain this, right? None of that nuance, right? So then we ping pong between masks don't work to now you have to wear a mask. We go from, we have these very absolutist messaging that then when the data changes or something else changes because our understanding evolves, it's really hard to pivot from something that you said absolutely, unequivocally, and then equivocate after the fact. And that, I think, leads to that sense of mistrust. It leads to a lot of broken clocks being right twice a day when it comes to conspiracy theories, which then, when you are not an entity that's accountable for everything you're saying, and you got a couple of things right, and you say, well, I'm just waiting for the other 10 to be proven down the line, right? So if you don't start from that position of, number one, I've had a lot of conversations with folks where I maybe started off because of maybe some epithets that were hurled at me from the outset, not necessarily thinking incredibly highly of an individual, and really being proven wrong, right? If you're not engaging with constituents, if you're not talking to them, and if you are just coming from a position of arrogance, which I think is, it can be hard for an authority to continually have to touch that groundstone, especially when you're getting, death threats or kind of vitriol on a daily basis. Again, then that just encourages somebody to pull back. Now you're just further distant, further removed. And so you need to fight against that impulse. But to build that trust, you have to give people credit. You have to, even if they may seem not to deserve it, you have to do something to overcome that, or else it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then that person that you think is stupid and you treat like they're an idiot are maybe going to be encouraged to do something dumb. People are smart. Like, they're even somebody who may not seem to have a lot of light bulbs going off in their mind, like, people are living their lives. And I think it's important for officials to always recognize that, because as soon as you start to treat your constituents as one manipulatable mob, you are going to just ensure that that's how they end up viewing themselves to fit that frame.
Yeah, Peter, that was very well said. And the CDC could have used you as their spokesperson early on, because what you just said would have been tremendously more helpful.
The J&J vaccine kind of speed bump, right?
Exactly. And so the CDC truly is, and has been for a long time, the foremost public health research agency in the world. And they undid all of that. They did all of that with some of the mistakes early on. And it wasn't the only example, but there were a number that caused people to lose trust. And when you do that, the door opens to all kinds of other ideas and conspiracies and alternative theories, and creates a vacuum for credibility that was filled by others. And the same thing happened at other levels of government as well. Locally, I remember during those early days, we met here in Southwest Michigan, many of the health officers. We assessed the risks, and we determined that the best place for kids at that time was in the classroom. And we communicated that to the state, and they said, okay, that's a message we support. We had a press conference saying that, and then later that night, they reversed course and said that the schools are going to be closed. So it was that sort of missed messaging and opportunities and conflicting messages that quickly caused people to say, these clowns don't know what they're doing. And when that happened, the confidence and the credibility that we all had started to fade.
So to follow up with that, what are you doing at the health department to try to regain trust? And maybe you alluded to a couple of the issues that the health department is seeing these days around mental health and other things. But what are some of those top issues, and what are you all doing to actively try to rebuild that trust?
Yeah, it's a great question, Megan. So we're really getting back to the things that we have done well and we do well. And we offer programming across a huge variety of issues, and we have people who are trained as subject matter experts in a wide variety of things. And getting back to the enormity of things, whether it's hearing and vision, or restaurant, food safety, drinking water quality, lead inspections. There's so many things that we do really well, and we want to continue to be proficient and to increase our presence in those areas. Building back trust, that's a challenge, right? And so we certainly have a large portion of the community that does trust us, and we're very grateful for them. And there are others that it's going to take some time. And so we know that. We want to make sure that we're mindful of that we're inviting them to the conversation, that we're present in those parts of the community, and it's going to take time. There's just no other solution to this. It's being authentic, being transparent, and having them have a seat at the table with us.
I think of how much better our institutions would be
and I look at this, I spent a lot of time around the Afghanistan withdrawal, and it's one thing to see somebody in a position of power make a mistake, and there are mistakes that you can make that are inexcusable, there are mistakes that are forgivable, but to me, forgivable mistakes, when they're made, become unforgivable if that individual isn't willing to even acknowledge that, right? If there's no reflection, if there's no humility within. And I think of some of the retrospectives with, and not just, COVID, but any number of things over the past time where it was like, well, would you do anything differently? Or do you have any regrets? Maybe the question's asked by a reporter and somebody says no or none. I got Taco Bell earlier. I regret my order. And not just going to Taco Bell, but how I formulated it, right? Like, if you are thinking about anything, you are going to have regrets. You can defend decisions. You can say, listen, we were doing the best with the best information we had. However, in this sweep of history, I look back and at this point, we could have done something differently. At that point, maybe we erred too much on the side of caution, or we should have erred on the side of caution more. But the sort of reflexive defense that I think is oftentimes brought about because then you have to, that individual may think, well, I have to say I have no regrets, because if I say I regret X, headline, Dr. Fauci says he has regrets, and then it just gets extrapolated into extremes, right? But we spend so much time worrying about the worst case possible reaction that it almost primes that type of a consequence, because folks just shut down. And you can't, rebuilding trust, rebuilding is an active concept. It's a verb. You have to do something. It won't just happen organically over time. It's not growing a beard. It's something that has to be flexed and practiced. And I think that that starts with acknowledging and having a sense of humility as an elected or kind of appointed official.
So there's a couple questions here about political innovation. Getting rid of the Electoral College, wondering if we need a new party system. So let's take a little time to dream a little dream about where our country could go. But Adam, I'll actually throw this to you as well. As you think about public health, you just made a couple references to the CDC. Do you have any ideas about, maybe these are a couple things we could do that I think might make the system better? Things if you were the CDC director for a day that you might want to try or pilot to see what would happen?
Well, communications need to improve. And I think that's first and foremost, is I think that we've lost a lot of the narrative. And social media, I think, is one of those elements that we need to have a better presence, a more creative presence in. I can remember to go backwards before social media, because I remember those days when we would have an event, say a spillage of a chemical into a creek or sewage or something, or an outbreak. We would try to communicate that with a press release, a fax, and an email, and then hope that the media would take that as an important bit of information to share. We kind of held our breath and crossed our fingers, and sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. With the advent of social media, we really, I think, saw the opportunity to become the media. And I think we've done a lot of that. And I think here in Kent County, we used a lot of that in the information that we share with the community, in our studio, and other things. The reality was that the rest of the world also said that we can be the media too. And so everyone became the media. And so no one was really the conveyor of authentic messaging that was reliable. And I think that's where the CDC could have an opportunity for improvement going forward, is can you own that, not own, it's always going to be a shared space, but can you rebuild credibility there with messaging and be present in that space in a way that lends itself to people following what you're saying and believing it.
Sure. So should we expect the Dancing Dr. London TikTok account or Instagram handle?
No, nobody wants that. That would not be
helpful. Anytime
This
soon?
No, we're good.
Might be eye-catching, though. People might pay attention. Yeah. Peter, what about you? So there's a lot of things there. Constitutional Convention, Electoral College. My personal favorite, ranked choice voting, that I'm intrigued about. What kinds of things do you think we might need to be looking at, or not at all?
No, our system's perfectly fine. Don't change a thing. Right? Well, I mean, media is a big problem. And I don't just mean partisan media, I also mean the way in which, out of curiosity, is there a reporter from the Grand Rapids Press here? Really? Okay, awesome. This is wonderful. I think I spoke to the Grand Rapids Press, and you guys were on our press. Okay, I'm not going to. The Grand Rapids Press was on our kind of press list, active engagement, but it's a newspaper that has seen declining revenue, obviously, declining staff. I think I spoke to them 4 times over the course, as an actual elected official, apart from of political campaigns, maybe 4 times, while I was in Congress. So over a 2-year period, 4 times. Contrast with the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press that I would talk to in some weeks 2 or 3 times a week, depending on what bills we had going forward. And it was just the kind of shrinking of local news coverage, or the ways in which we've gone from having the local news be mainly print to mainly TV. And there are far more stories to cover than there are reporters to cover those stories. That's a massive problem, because if you're always having to go to a national source to get news, you have issues that, again, even the most intrepid reporter can only cover so many beats, can only write so many articles. And I think then, if you don't have a reporter, talking or being at every county commission meeting, every city commission meeting, holding your feet to the fire on something, but also knowing enough about the issue to ask you the questions that need to be asked of you, right? That becomes a big problem. And the amount of times, this is not a Grand Rapids Press dig, but the amount of times I've had an interview with a reporter where I just feel terrible, because it's clear this reporter doesn't know what they're talking about going in, because they're covering sports and education and religion and also politics. And so can we talk off the record? Let me maybe help you understand this issue, because the questions you're asking are clear that you don't, as opposed to I've talked to reporters who asked me questions about a bill that I wrote, and I was like, I'm having the best time of my life because you just asked me a question I couldn't answer. And I will get back to you, but thank you for spending so much time on this issue, right? So if you don't have that, again, that media, that neutral arbiter between the elected official and the audience and the constituents, if you don't have that mechanism, nobody has the time. If that reporter doesn't have enough time as their full-time job to be able to spend, getting to know that issue, what luck does the average individual have, right? So that is, I think, a massive problem that there was no political solution to. People have introduced, we got to have federal funding for local media. It's like, oh my God, you don't see how this could go terribly wrong. But I love the reforms around just forcing our parties to do better by making a more competitive landscape and environment. I think from a messaging standpoint, calling ranked choice voting instant runoff is probably the easier kind of hold, but not having, making folks feel like they have more of an impact with their vote, rather than somebody living in, a blue state or a red state, and they know that the odds of their party winning, so what's even the point? Or, you have, scenarios where primary turnout, this is a massive issue in Chicago, in the city of Chicago and city of New York. You have individuals being able to choose, rather unique times and places to hold elections in ways that intentionally shrink how many voters are going to come out. And because of, the lower participation in a primary relative to a general, it enables machine politics to really take over in a way that's massively beneficial for the incumbents and members of that machine, but at the expense of the rest of the constituents feeling well governed. So bring on more competition.
Okay. Sounds like the system's ripe for opportunity.
Yeah.
Audience question here: how can we help future generations engage politically in ways that are healthy? And I want to add on to that, I love this question. How do we also help future generations know what to do when their particular viewpoint is either not sanctioned, it's not the one that wins? How do we teach people what to do with that? And Adam, I think that has local implications as well.
Yeah, so I think getting people involved early, and somehow we've lost this in the education process. I mean, I don't know where we're learning about this level of participation anymore, because we ought to be encouraging people to be involved from an early age. And then not just seeing the toxicity of the things that we're talking about, because I think that is really repulsive to a lot of people when it comes to getting involved in the process. But also recognizing and appreciating the good things that are happening. And while we're here to talk about political violence and how that's negatively affected, the reality is there's been a lot of good that's happened in the past couple of years as well. And everyone's heard the stories that Peter and I have of death threats and violence and all of that. But I don't think people hear about the good part of it, the encouraging part of it. And for example, I've got just one of many Ziploc bags that I have of thank you notes and letters of congratulations and pictures that little kids painted. Thank you, Dr. London. Thank you, Kent County Health Department. Well, this kind of stuff really makes a difference. Their participation in doing these things made a difference for all of us, kept us going, kept us inspired. And I think, being grateful for that hopefully gets younger people involved and keeps the community involved in a way that is positive, and not just seeing what they're hearing on and seeing on TV and in the media about the negativity.
Oh, I mean, I think one of my frustrations in the moment is getting politically involved usually means, commenting on social media or attending a rally or some other more kind of performative manifestation rather than something tangible. And how much I would love for that, hey, you want to know what government does? You want to know this thing that we do together? Let's, try to organize a cleanup of the park. Let's, petition the city council to increase funding, to plant more trees in this neighborhood, right? Like I think if you have young people who look around them and see participating and getting involved with government as a means of improving the community they see around them, I can imagine few things more inspiring than that, as opposed to the way of involvement being, you see these people over there, they hate you, they're terrible, I'm going to help you fight against them, and then folks just getting dragged into the same polarization. And I think how much of our politics is consumed by just an absolutism and an inability to see anything good about your political opponent. And so, I mean, I know it's supposed to be like, I'm going to get the positive, the optimism.
Yeah, when's that going to happen?
The action
It's
message.
been a while now.
No, but I've been blown away, frankly, at friendships I've made with people who started off, it just started off like, yeah, but it's the narcissism of small differences at the end of the day, right? And how essential it is, and this is something I always check myself on, if I see something in the media and I think, yeah, that's what those people would do, it just immediately confirms all my priors. It hits every little bias button. Well, of course, this Democrat over here, or of course, this crazy Republican would have done X, Y, or Z. If it seems too perfect in aligning with my priors, it probably is. And then I dig into that issue and, it's always more complex, right? It's never, sometimes it is pretty black and white on, because there are some really reprehensible individuals in our political system. But for the vast majority, there's always more there, right? If you see somebody and they seem to be, hitting every one of those sort of negative indicators as somebody that you probably wouldn't like, they may be coming into that interaction with the exact same view of you, and all it takes is to kind of change the direction a little bit. And I think if we had more of that in our community, right? You can't always wait for the other person to take the initiative, right? I mean, taking that initiative to not write somebody off because of their presumed politics, to be able to say, hey, well, we probably disagree on this, but there's probably 95 things that we do agree on, and let's talk about that, shift that conversation. More participation in civic environments rather than getting into, well, I can't go to that church anymore because they've gotten too political in this direction or in that, or I'm not going to participate in this civic club. All of those spaces that we end up abandoning because we feel like other people are taking them over. I mean, whoever is filling the vacuum that you created is probably not going to be somebody who shares your perspective or is willing to engage with that type of nuance. So I mean, at the end of the day, really being the change that you wish to see and modeling the behavior you hope for others to do. And there's going to be some, people who don't react well, but I would guarantee there's probably a lot more people who will reflect back kind of that empathy and kindness when it's shown to them than people who just scoff and walk away.
And I think it's really incumbent upon us as leaders, and this applies to everyone in this room as well, as leaders in the community, to be intentional about finding those spaces for participation and that dialogue. Whether it's something large, and what came to mind as you were talking, Peter, was the West Michigan Vaccine Clinic, where we didn't have the staff to make that place work. We called upon the community for volunteers, and the turnout and response we got was overwhelming. Thousands upon thousands of hours of volunteer time given to us by people of every stripe in the community and all political persuasions. And I know, because I spoke to pretty much all of them, how they left that place feeling as though they were part of the community and really connected to the process. I think that, we talk a lot about we need to encourage participation, but talking about it, we got to find ways to make it happen. I think, really being creative about how we invite people to spaces and really, ask for their help when we need it. Serving next to each other and breaking bread with one another. Those are powerful and oftentimes not expensive things for us to do to help to overcome the otherism that's so common right now. And to think better about one another and not just what the political identifiers might be.
I say that there are probably some, well, there's at least one local elected official, but there's some people where I'm like, I think I could practice it. It might be a Herculean effort around some individuals, because it's hard for me to look at somebody and not be like, yeah, I saw all those things you said about me, right? But for the average person, it's essential, right? There's no replacing that. But to your point on the vaccine clinic, having that common mission, I think is so important, because then that breaks down barriers that might otherwise exist. If you're always coming into it wearing, a partisan jersey of one stripe or the other, even if you're engaged in the same mission, you're still coming at it as members of opposite teams.
Yeah.
So I'm hearing you both sort of bring up some ideas about what we can all do to help prevent political violence, and maybe having dinner with a neighbor who we differ from doesn't sound like a huge thing, but that's really where it starts, right? And it's with some of those relationships. We heard that earlier in the day too. What other solutions do you see to the problem of political violence, and whose responsibility is it? Is it individuals? Is it institutions? Is it public servants, political parties? Whose task is this? And do you have, what other ideas do you have about how we address this?
I mean, it's all of our responsibilities. I mean, ideally, you have elected individuals or parties or individuals in power who are measured and thoughtful and view political violence as something that is abhorrent to our democratic process, is abhorrent to the way that our country operates. But far too often, those same officials end up betraying that responsibility by saying, well, they didn't do anything about their people over here, so why should we do something about our folks over here? Or some convoluted way that basically boils down to they started it. And so, in the absence of them taking responsibility, I think that responsibility just ends up, floating downwards. And so there's nobody in a participatory democracy, there's nobody who doesn't bear some obligation. It may be larger or smaller depending on your ability to project influence, but everybody bears that responsibility.
Yeah, I can't agree more, and I wish I could. Because I've thought about this an awful lot. I wish that there was one clear party that it's their responsibility. The tough answer is that it really is all of our responsibility. There's just no way around this. Megan, I want to thank you and the Houndstein Center for pulling this event together, because I think gatherings like this and conversations like this and everyone being here this evening to talk about these issues and explore them together, that's a big part of the solution. Without this, it's hard to have home bases in the community where we can come together and have these important conversations. So really it's everyone's responsibility, and we need to get back to having a shared sense of mission and purpose in the community as well. And again, thinking better of one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, bringing this close to home, we're here tonight because of a vision and a dream and a mission of Colonel Ralph Houndstein, who endowed our center. And his mission was really to raise the next generation of ethical, effective leaders for the 21st century, which is what we seek to do here. And you all are part of that as we continue in our lifelong learning together. So we do have some students here tonight, and a lot of what we do is like to put people on stages who can talk about their career journeys and their leadership journeys. So, as we think about where you're at in career, did you expect at any point as you were entering your careers of politics and public service and other, that you would have to reckon with political violence? And if not, would you have changed your minds if you had known that it was coming? And what advice would you give to some of our students who are here tonight, or anyone else who might be thinking about public service?
Most of my experience before this had been in a war zone or someplace where, you saw the sad manifestation of that, and where neighbors were fighting neighbors, and when kind of societies collapse into that anarchy. And so, it didn't surprise me, just because I had been growing increasingly disconcerted and concerned, and I probably wouldn't have run for office if I thought everything was going well and we're good. But you shouldn't, I mentioned earlier, like crazy people running for office. You have to be a little bit crazy, a little bit narcissistic, a little bit arrogant to even have it in your head to put yourself forward in that scenario. And there's you hope that those aren't the defining characteristics of somebody seeking office. But I think I'm stubborn enough that it isn't a dissuasive factor to me. But I'm also blessed with a wife who complements and is equally stubborn. And so we don't view those type of threats as something to kind of clutch our pearls about, but more. I think I counseled an aid worker in Kabul one time. I was like, well, look on the bright side. If nobody's trying to kill you, do you really matter that much? And it was kind of a dark humor moment, because you're in Afghanistan. The mortality rate for folks doing what we were doing was about 1 in 50 a year, which usually you run the numbers and you're like, oh, it's a lot safer than I thought. And I ran the numbers. I was like, oh man, that is not safe. That is, oh yeah, no, I know a lot of those names. But I think it's that sense of that's the reality today, and it's not a reality we should accept. But I think better for somebody to steel themselves going in than to be kind of brutally confronted with that reality after the fact.
Okay.
And so, Peter, thank you for your service. So I wouldn't have changed anything. I entered public health knowing there was going to be conflict. Not violence necessarily, but conflict, because in public health we have to say no on occasion. We have to say no to people when they want to serve unsafe food to the public, or where they're discharging sewage into the ditch. So there's all kinds of reasons why we have to say no to people, and sometimes that makes them very angry. And so we frequently deal with conflict on a small scale. I can remember when I was new in the field, there was a much more seasoned, wise person who, after one of those tough conflicts, say, oh, don't worry about it. Dogs don't bark at parked cars. And and this is not to mean that those people were dogs, but was to mean that if in this field you have to make tough decisions, you have to do things that matter, and sometimes ruffle feathers. And if you're not doing those things, you're not making a change, you're not really protecting the community. And if that's the way you're going to be, then you definitely need to think about doing something else. And so my advice would be just to go into it with eyes wide open, that it is work that really, truly does matter, but sometimes you're gonna get barked at. And that's okay. The other thing that I would say, and it's almost become a cliche these days, is you have to take care of yourself. And all of us, all of our fields have stresses, and those fields that deal with a lot of conflict and sometimes aggression, we have to be very, very mindful of taking care of ourselves as well. And I say that as a bit of a confession from someone who didn't and doesn't really follow that advice as often as I should. I can remember at one point, about 2 years into the pandemic, where working 6-7 days a week, weekends, holidays, no vacation. The team and I had a conversation about where would we like to go on vacation if we could. And the thought about it, I said, you know what I want to do? I just want to go in the woods and stare at a tree for about 2 weeks. And so to those students who are here, if you ever get to a point where you just want to go stare at a tree for a while, you're not taking good enough care of yourself. So you have to be mindful of that as well. Find work that matters. Don't be afraid to get barked at, ruffle feathers once in a while, and take care of yourself. Really important.
Except if you're an arborist, in which case staring at trees is perfectly healthy and you're in the right place. Yeah.
In which case, maybe you need to go look at a building for a while.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up our conversation. I want to thank you again both so much for your insights tonight. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
I know the topic was political violence, preventing political violence, but I think the takeaways for me tonight are really about trust and working hard to regain trust and to take steps to build more trust in the institutions I'm a part of and also those that I look up to. I think we heard clear messages about the power that voters have and that each of us have in being a part of the solutions to making this happen. Engagement was certainly a theme, right? I will shamelessly plug, as a former municipal official, every one of your municipalities has boards and commissions with open seats. Anything from Parks and Rec to trees to building inspections. And so we encourage you all to go get involved at a local level. And I think always a great reminder is just the humanity that we can find in each other. And to remember that while we carry titles and responsibilities, that at the end of the day, we're all humans. And I guess also, if you ever can't find Dr. London, go check the woods in a tree, because he might be out there staring. But again, I want to thank you all for being here, taking time to wrestle with these important topics. We invite you out to the exhibition hall after this to sit down with someone, maybe someone who has different views than you do, have a conversation, enjoy a little dessert, and keep the action and keep this going. Again, we want to thank our partners at the Ford Foundation for making today possible. To all of our Hauenstein Center members, we appreciate you. We would love to have more of you if you're not already engaged. And if you haven't already gotten the invite, we will be celebrating the graduation of some of our Cook Leadership Academy candidate fellows next Thursday, and you're all welcome back for that as well. So with that, I bid you good night. Thank you.
Thank you.